So to understand why all of this happens, but even more importantly, to then understand what are some of the great processes that we can use to move through these moments so that we grow at the same rate as our clients grow. Let's begin by understanding more about neuroscience, about what is the role of our brains in relationship. How does this triggering happen? What does it all mean? Let's have a look at what neuroscientists now describe as the triune brain. It's as if we have a brain that is in three parts. And neuroscientists like to use a model of a hand, your fist holding your thumb this way. Here are the three parts. In this one hand, one fist model of the brain, you can say that the wrist and the forearm is the medulla. It's the most ancient part of the human brain. It takes care of our most reptilian, primordial responses, our survival instincts. Okay, so fight or flight, pleasure, seeking, eating, sleeping, etc. It triggers all of those actions. Now, the part that's inside, that's covered over in the middle, that is the limbic brain. That's the part of the brain that generates or is in charge of our human emotion, all of our emotional reactions, our emotional responses. And then wrapped over the top of the limbic brain is the neocortex, the rational, thought processing, planning part of the brain. And that's the part of the brain that differentiates us from other apes, such as chimpanzees. In particular, it's the frontal lobes that is just behind our forehead. That's the part of our brain that contains our impulses, that reduces the intensity of emotion, the 240 volts of emotion, into 12 volts so that we can speak appropriately, so that we can dialogue, converse about our feelings without acting out. And there's a new science. This is the new science called interpersonal neuropsychology. Very, very interesting, with a lot of new research coming out over recent years. Interpersonal neuropsychology is the recognition that in any exchange between two or more people, we are in fact regulating, like it or not, whether we realize it or not, we are regulating each other's limbic brains. We are regulating each other's emotional states. So when a relationship between two individuals is harmonious and balanced, we both fall into a state of well-being, openness, and attunement to one another, perhaps even feelings of warmth. Okay? When we are dysregulated, we're triggering each other. That happens, and it's a very, very normal process. We are reminding each other through the senses, our behaviors, our physical and facial expressions are reminding one another of past experience, so that there is a limbic firing of past remembered emotion. Moving along, what's actually happening now, coming back to the therapist and client situation, is that when our client is expressing their worst pain, this causes us to relive some of our own pain, which means that understanding our own emotional wounds is the most important factor in the helping professions. It's the most important factor. I think even more important than all of the terrific skills of intervention that we amass over the years. Let's understand a little bit more of how this body memory works. Neuroscientists have discovered that there are essentially two different kinds of memory. The first memory is called narrative memory. That is the most familiar kind of memory, the one that we mostly refer to when I say I remember this or I remember that. That's narrative memory, in which we recall a story. We recall a chronology of events, and we see a little movie in our minds telling us the order of things that happened. Narrative memory, or story memory if you like, is principally organized by a part of the brain called the hippocampus. That part of the brain isn't really mature until we're about 2, 3, 4 years of age, and that's why most people think that we can't remember before that age, as if we can't remember anything. But there is a second and very important quality of memory, and that's called, by the neuroscientists, implicit memory. Implicit memory. A lot of psychotherapists, counselors prefer to give it a different name, body memory. In implicit memory, we recall not necessarily what happened, but how we felt at an earlier time of our life. And that's organized by a separate part of the brain, which is called the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is mature before we are born, roughly about the 3rd trimester in our mother's womb, so that our bodies are capable of amassing and storing body memory, the memory of sensation and emotion, all the way back to the 3rd trimester in the womb. What actually happens in interaction with one another, sometimes we trigger in each other just a waft or the smoky presence of an old emotion that starts to complicate our perception. Like a flavor, a taste. Sometimes it might be fleeting, sometimes it's overwhelming, of an old feeling that can date back to last year, when we were adolescents, when we were children, even when we were very, very small babies, perhaps even just before birth. What we see is very complicated with our own lived experience. We see mostly memory. Implicit memory, why is it triggered? This is because implicit memory is understood to be state dependent. When our bodies are put in a state that is similar to an old experience, that has the propensity to bring up a little bit of the old experience. That comes to us through our senses. For instance, when you smell something like cinnamon, for example, and it reminds you of a beautiful dessert that your mother used to make, and it brings up the old feelings from the past. Or when you hear a song that reminds you of a bittersweet moment in your adolescence, and you start to relive some of those feelings. Or when you see somebody walking in a very aggressive manner, and through the eyes, that triggers you into a memory of somebody who was aggressive towards you, and some of the old fear comes up, etc., etc. When your body is a little bit put into a state that is similar to an old experience, the old emotions come up. It was also very interesting to discover that the ocular nerve, the nerve that connects our eyes to our brain, connects very, very strongly and principally with memory centers in the brain, so that we don't always see very clearly what is in front of us. The sum total of what we think that we see is a mixture of the real world and triggered memory. We tend to fill in the gaps. Our brains fill in the gaps with lived experience. So we see a composite. And that tells you how often we are triggered. But it also tells you how normal this process is, so that there is no reason at all for any of us to feel bad about it. In fact, it can be useful for an old body memory to come up, because it helps us potentially to feel a bridge of empathy where we can understand the state of vulnerability that our client is in, simply because we ourselves have once been that vulnerable in one way or another. So it can be useful, but it can also get in the way. Another implication of understanding that three-part, the triune brain, is that neuroscientists have discovered that the information flows go far more frequently and rapidly from the limbic brain to the cortex and the frontal lobes. In other words, our emotions are telling our thinking part of the brain how to think and what to think. Our feelings influence our perception and our behavior and our thoughts far, far more than our thoughts influencing our feelings. Okay? And that's because of the information superhighway. It's as if there are 6 lanes going from the limbic brain to the frontal lobes, but only 1 lane going the other way. And that gives us reason to be very, very accepting of how come our emotions rule our thinking so much. It doesn't mean there's nothing we can do about this, but it gives us reason to be very, very accepting about that. So there is good reason that as practitioners, we should invite in ourselves a healthy level of self-doubt about what we think that we see in our clients, at least at first. Not to react to our perceptions too quickly, to at least at first begin by trying to filter out what is our own body memory that complicates our perception, projection, countertransference, to filter that out from what is in fact really about our client, what is about them as opposed to what is it about us. Let's go a little bit more deeply into some very, very useful, very relevant discoveries from modern interpersonal neuroscience. As I said earlier, body memory is centered in the amygdala, which was mature in the 3rd trimester. So now that's a breathtaking discovery. Our bodies are able to recall sensations and feelings, if only a little bit, all the way back to the 3rd trimester inside our own mother's womb. No wonder sometimes we feel so vulnerable, even though we don't really get what is it in our present environment that is causing us to feel so vulnerable. Well, it's not about the present sometimes. It's what's been triggered from the past. Now that should bring more compassion and understanding instead of thinking that we're going crazy or telling ourselves that we are irrational. Okay? It's not about irrationality, it's about memory, body memory. Body memory is coming up. See, once you understand that, the self-judgment eases, and I'll show you a process to help you process those old memories. The reactions of fight and flight that are habitual in our clients as well as in us are primed through very powerful key developmental experiences in childhood, both nourishing experiences, loving experiences, as well as traumatic, wounding experiences. That's why understanding our own childhood is so important. Childhood is the time, particularly early childhood, the first 3-4 years, and again adolescence. Those are times in which our frontal lobes are growing. In fact, most of our brain are growing at such an accelerated rate that the changes that happen then to the neural pathways in our brain in response to the way people are treating us, those changes become very solid, you see, and they can last for life. Changes can still continue to happen for the rest of our lives, but the changes go most deeply and most rapidly in our brains when we're little children or adolescents. So our reactions are conditioned or driven by these neural pathways that are formed as we begin to understand and be impacted by relationships with other humans. These adaptive, defensive, fight-or-flight responses, in other words, our habitual response to stress in our life, all the different kinds of stresses, our instant manner of responding to stress, that's been quite strongly wired into our brain through early experience, entrenched in the brain's wiring. And because these early changes are so powerful in our brain, this wiring, laid down through experience, can be very resistant to change. All that means is don't push too hard. Don't push yourself too hard. Don't expect too much from your clients. The survival strategies, the response fight or flight strategies that were set down in childhood are embedded in the brain's wiring and resistant to change. I didn't say impossible to change, but resistant to change. Our brain wants to hold on to what helped us to survive. Once we understand that, we become so much more patient and spacious in the work that we do, both with our own growth and our clients. But here is an important secret, an important helpful tool to understand. What happens when we begin to find the freedom to speak about our pain, to speak about our story, not just to anyone, but in a caring, emotionally safe environment, in an empathic space with our counselor, therapist, health professional. In those dialogues, what's happening is that we take the intense firing in the limbic brain. Do you remember the limbic brain? In the middle, the emotional part of the brain. We take the 240 volts of firing, alarm, the body memory of fear, trauma, rage. And by speaking, we're bringing that forward into the frontal lobes for processing, which tends to calm the energy, to settle and ground the electricity of emotion, transmuting it from 240 volts to 12 volts, making it safe to tell our story, making us able to take part in effective communication. So that, looking at our next slide, what this means is that, in summary, empathic two-way dialogue helps to reduce emotional pain by degrees, little by little, bringing from limbic firing to frontal lobe processing. You may have heard a saying that has arisen amongst therapists in recent years. A shorthand way of saying it is, when you can name it, you can tame it. Now, this not only applies to our clients, it applies to us as therapists. When we have been triggered and when we discover that our triggering is getting in the way of effective presence, effective communication, intervention with our clients. When we find a reflective space for ourselves separately, in between sessions, okay, that we can talk with somebody about the nature of what's been triggered up, the emotions that have come up, or even do some of our own reflective process, which I'll show you very shortly. That's in a way us naming our experience, which brings compassion and helps us to process it. When we name it, we can tame it. This will, by validating ourselves, renew our capacity to be present in a whole new way, and then changes our way of perceiving our client. That's the exciting part. When we change ourselves, we change how we perceive our client. They pick up on this immediately. They sense our solidity, our increased spaciousness. They open up more. They find their own strength more. Okay, so that's the value of people in the helping professions having a dedication, a commitment to really working with our own past, Why I mentioned the inner child, which is really a metaphoric term for body memory, is that most of our wounding, our deepest wounding, that causes the most painful emotions to be triggered in us, tend to happen in childhood, earliest childhood, middle childhood, adolescence. And most of us have lived through something painful, something traumatic, an emotional lack, a terrifying moment. Everybody has a story. So understanding our childhood is paramount. Becoming familiarized with the kinds of things that are likely to become triggers for us, so that between sessions with our clients, we can do the reflective work to bring us back to center, so that we don't detach, push too hard, or just simply overwork, forget our own boundaries, forget to rest, etc., which are the things that we do when we get triggered